Hello, I'm Ian Scales and you're watching TelecomTV's Executive Insight. Today I'm talking with Chris Smedley, who is the CEO of Jio, one of the UK's backbone fibre providers. And let's talk a little bit about two things. First of all, I understand that you've finished some new connections through to Ireland. We'll talk a little bit about that. And also let's reprise the UK's rural networking initiatives, which perhaps haven't worked out as much as we hoped they would at the time. So what's been happening for Jio in Ireland?
Okay, well, I think, as you know, Ian, our core business is very much focused around providing large data networks based on dedicated fibre for every customer. In the data centre markets, we serve a lot of banks, media businesses, online businesses, etc. Our Ireland announcement, which we made yesterday, is about a new ring network that we've built to pick up Dublin and the Republic of Ireland. It's in the same way that we have our networks that run around the south, the central and the northern parts of the UK. Two new subsea routes have been required for this, one which extends from the fibre speed network, which runs through North Wales, which is done in partnership with ESB Telecom, and then a northern route which is in partnership with Airgrid, the other part of the Irish electricity business, next to their new interconnector. So we've got high fibre count rings, a ring network now in and out of Dublin, which really allows us to serve the same markets that we do here in the UK, right. Data centres, large service providers, mobiles, etc.
But there's one area that perhaps you're not going to explore as much as you might have done about 2 years ago, and that was when the government in the UK announced an initiative to push into the rural areas and to try and provide fibre connectivity there. But that hasn't quite panned out in the way that everybody thought. Could you explain that?
No, well, it certainly hasn't. I mean, I think if you rewind a few years ago, we were very encouraged when the new government came in and announced that it was going to put, I think, 530 million was the original statement of public money into local authority procurements for rural broadband. We had already built the fibre speed network for the Welsh Government, which was one of the earliest interventions into broadband markets in rural areas in the UK. And we had a lot of experience of that, and we thought, well, this should be very interesting and a good growth opportunity for our business. We'd also been talking with other people in the industry about how one would do this, and the obvious need to avoid just digging up the streets and the rural areas all over again. And to make the best use of the infrastructure that was already there. So we'd been talking with others about, well, what is the equivalent to local loop unbundling? We felt that in a fibre world, you had to use the existing ducting or overhead system to put new fibre cables on. We still believe that. It's the obvious thing to do, whether you're BT or whoever else gets the public money to do that. We think our business model suits that area, or suited that area, open access networking, so that once you've got that high fibre count cable on there, anybody can come and use it, other service providers. And we still think that's a good model. It's the one that's being used in Australia and New Zealand and other areas where they see fibre as an infrastructure and really separate and structurally separate from the services that run over it.
You would think it's the way that the market should be headed. And what basically, there was no regulatory movement on that to open that up.
I think there was some good progress a couple of years ago. Ofcom ran something called I think it was the Wholesale Local Access Market Review. And that's where this intervention called PIA, or Passive Infrastructure Access, came from, which is effectively access to BT's ducts and pole system. And things were looking pretty good at that stage, because it looked like Ofcom was on that same page, understanding that everybody had to be able to access that part of the system. The problem was it only dealt with the access market, and its use as a product was limited to residential broadband provision, which is important, and it's what everybody talks about, but by value is actually a minority part of any market, of the telecoms market in the UK. Just as important is providing services to businesses, to public sector, to mobile providers. And you couldn't use it for that. BT is able to, because it's its system and can deploy network for all purposes. Other people can't.
Because if you were able to do both, of course, you would be able to amortise that cost across two distinct markets, wouldn't it? So instead of having just to serve a residential market, say, or a business market, you would be able to make it much more economical by being able to serve all of those different customers in the one region.
Absolutely. I mean, very simply, the business case is much less effective when you can only serve one part of the market.
That's
the costs
what networks are all about, isn't it? Get as many people on as you can. So essentially, by being able to argue the limited use case. Okay, so we're going to make this dispensation where you can access our infrastructure, but you can only do it under these circumstances. You essentially ruled it uneconomic for anybody to actually undertake.
Yeah, I think it's almost impossible to take on BT, who has the access to the network and the current system, which is about 1/20th cheaper than digging up the roads all over again. So if you have access to it, you've got a fantastic cost base. If you don't, then you're going to struggle to win any procurements from that point. But if you then can only use it for part of the market, and if on top of that, as a bidder to take these things on, you are having to compete with that incumbent for the right to become a challenger to it, whereas the incumbent is actually fighting for the right to remain the only player in the market.
Yes.
It's an almost impossible position. So about a year ago, we just looked at this and said, look, without the regulatory backup, without the intervention in this market, in the same way that governments in Australia and New Zealand and other places have done, without that, it's really just too much of an exposure to our very successful other business to really take this on.
So what sort of arguments are deployed against you when you talk and you make submissions to the regulator, if you bother to, in fact? What does BT say that, for reasons that they don't want to do that? Is it simply just a financial interest, and they say that we're going to lose scale and it won't be fair to us?
Well, I'm slightly guessing exactly what BT say, because they're obviously not in the room when we are, but I think from what I can tell is BT feel that this model is in some way defunct. I think they see it as being part of the history of duct leasing and fibre sales that happened in the alternative part of the industry in the late 90s, and don't see that people made money out of that, and believe, I think, that it's perhaps not a valid business model. You just can't make profit from it.
And just briefly, overseas, in other parts of Europe, do they have a similar dispensation, or is it still tied down there?
We've watched very carefully those countries like New Zealand that have picked up the full structural separation, and whether businesses like ours, which is there to provide fibre leasing. And it's actually probably one of the big missing parts of the debate here in the UK. PIA is actually the right to build the network. It's actually not the equivalent of LLU.
No.
The equivalent of LLU is fibre leasing
Yes.
of that cable.
Yes.
So whoever gets the right to build it first, particularly when it's with public money, we would argue should then adopt the fibre leasing
Yes.
model so that everybody has access to those underlying inputs. And I think that's the really missing part. And we do see fibre leasing evolving all over the world. When we set up Geo, which is 10 years ago now, certainly in the UK, we were the only business that focused on dedicated fibre leasing for every customer. Yes, it was in the business market, but then most evolutions in telecom start in the business space and then trickle down.
Chris, thank you very much. Very interesting.
Pleasure.